those of us that are employees at Spitz have a particular affinity for Armand Spitz for, I think, obvious reasons. But, there's also a debt of gratitude for the industry because of his contributions to the planetarium world. And we've had Verne, Armand Spitz's daughter. She was here at Spitz 2 weeks ago, talked to the company last week. She talked at Spitz. Very well received. And there's nothing like true oral history sometimes. And so with that, I'm very pleased to introduce Verne Rice, daughter of Armand Spitz, a lovely lady with great stories and a perspective that none of us can have. You can read, you can know your history, but the reality of knowing the person and getting the stories firsthand can't be replaced. So, as I said, it's with great pleasure that I introduce Verne Rice.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for being here. I have been told that this needs to be about here, and I tend to go like that. So if you lose me, would you please yell and wave and remind me? I also have to confess that I am 77 years old, and so I'm going to work from an outline, and I hope that'll be okay. This situation is really weird. I have actually talked at one time or another about pharmaceutical industry research and finances and politics, and I've talked about breastfeeding, and I have talked about mental health issues because I changed my career at one point, and I've talked about identity theft. But until just recently, I have never talked publicly about my father. So this is a very strange and I hope wonderful experience for me as well as for you, because I don't know anything about astronomy very much, and I don't know about planetariums very much, but I do know about my father, and it began to sound like more and more fun. I don't remember the soap can that some of you may have heard about that was at the first planetarium. I think I saw it perhaps for the second time in my life, and it's out in the lobby there. The story was that my father decided that I needed stars on my bedroom ceiling. I don't remember that that ever happened, but I guess it did because we've made some sort of legend out of it. One thing that I can honestly also say I don't remember is my first photo op performance. I went topless, as you see. I was about 5 months old, and the moon upon which I am being supported by my mother was something that my father created sometime before I was born. And there's a bit of a story about that. I'm going to read a couple of sentences occasionally from a book that my mother wrote about the old house that we lived in Newtown Square before I was born and after I was born. And I need to give a plug. The old house was the first part of it was built in 1696. This is a house in Broomall, I'm sorry. We used to call it Newtown Square, Pennsylvania. And it's the Thomas Massey House. And some new friends of mine from Thomas Massey House are here. Many of the stories I'm going to talk about came from being in the whole atmosphere of the Thomas Massey House. I suggest if you're from nearby and you haven't seen it, go see it. It's wonderful. A first story, and my mother wrote, "There is something to be said for a man who can make messes in the kitchen." Oh, has anybody here ever boiled cream of wheat? I don't want to ask for a show of hands. For a man who can make messes in the kitchen, boiling cream of wheat and watching it bubble and break. And the reason for this was that so he could get a line on Crater Foundation. And he was looking for the way things bubbled and popped and rolled over like craters. He built the moon after he learned about making craters, and this was a hemisphere with apparently relatively realistic placement of important craters. I think it was about 5 feet tall. It was made of paper mache and fish paste, and it started out at the Franklin Institute, and it ended up in possession of the Academy of Natural Sciences. And it also was featured, this was my only magazine cover appearance, on something called Science Newsletter in 1936. So if you get nothing else from what I have to say, it's the fact that practically everything that Armand did and thought and lived and breathed reflected his passion and his interest about psychiatry. Where did that come from? This is getting really bad. About astronomy and teaching science. He had no training in astronomy. He started out as a journalist. When he and my mother, who together edited a couple of newspapers, the Haverford Township News and so forth, many years ago, when they were courting, they were looking for a place to live. There were paupers, and they found an old house out in the country, which was the Thomas Massey house. And while they were peering over the overgrowth between the road and the house, my mother asked, "What's the star up there?" And my father said, "I don't know, but I'll find out for you." And so he set out to do so. He, at one point, remarked that the way to learn something you don't know about is to write a book about it. And so he started doing his own research, and a couple of years later was born a book called The Pinpoint Planetarium. And if you want to take a look at it, this is a reasonably elementary book, largely about constellations. At the back of it, there were cutouts based on latitude and longitude and the seasons of the year, so that people who wanted to could cut these out, turn them into domes, make pinpricks in them, hold them up to the sky, and see the constellations which were actually happening here. It was kind of fun, and I think it propelled his interest in going on with astronomy. He began to feel that he couldn't really do all of this stuff unless he had a telescope, but he couldn't afford one. So he tried to find ways of getting parts, and he didn't. My mother went on to say, and I'll read because her words are better than mine, taking down the stoves. In the old house, we had kerosene stoves and fireplaces, and they were the only sources of heat. Taking down the stoves in the spring had given him an idea. And inspired by the lovely contours of the piece of stovepipe on these stoves, he started to build a telescope. Without waiting to gather unto himself the materials designated for the purpose by scientific treatises. He used bits and pieces of this and that, and the big flat top of a cook stove was turned into a grindstone. And on it he ground the mirror, which became the basis of this first telescope. It took him about 40 hours just to work on the mirror, hours of devotion and perspiration, and after many, many weekends, he got it assembled, and to everybody's utter amazement, it worked. So he continued with telescope making, and I guess as I developed, the telescopes developed. Also, his knowledge and passion about astronomy developed, and people started coming out to see things through the telescope. Main social events for my family became looking at auroras and eclipses, and when the weather held, here we were in a place where there were no lights, there was no smog. Viewing the sky was really a remarkable thing. Many of his friends and colleagues came from the city. Apparently there were some real problems with people who came on nights which were overcast or rainy, because they'd look at the telescope and say, "So what?" You know, they couldn't see anything. But the concept for most people who were not scientific was you ought to be able to look through the telescope and see what wasn't visible anyway. So he somehow managed to overcome that, and I remember some very good parties based on telescope looking. Earlier, I think, than his passion for astronomy, he had gotten interested in meteorology. And I have a story which will embarrass my daughter, who is here, but this was a true story for me. I was scared to death, as kids are. I was scared to death of thunderstorms. And so my father taught me in one of his first episodes of science teaching that when I saw lightning, what I should do is count the second is 1, the second is 2, the second is 3, and then clap my hands as hard as I can, which I can't do because I'll fling the microphone, and yell as loud as I could while I was clapping, "Natural phenomenon!" And the idea behind this was really very, very sound behavioral intervention. I was going to drown out the sound of the thunder. So if I was taking part in drowning it out, I didn't have to be scared. I will tell you that after years of scientific research, I tried it with my daughter and it didn't work. But it worked for me, and I still think it was a fairly brilliant intervention. As I said, we lived in this wonderful, beautiful, cold, cold house. And shortly after I was born, Armand started to work for the Franklin Institute, mainly as a publicist. And somehow I was allowed to go with him to work, where I guess I slept in God knows what, but it was warm there. And I was allowed to toddle around the Franklin Institute, and I developed a great relationship with Benjamin Franklin, whom I think I actually went and talked to. I had heard a fair amount about Franklin at that point, but I developed an elaborate fantasy, which I think he probably prompted by telling me things about Franklin. That if I looked over Franklin's right shoulder, I could see into his bedroom. And on the walls, he had kites, and he had keys, artistically arranged. And mainly on his bedside table was a pair of his spectacles, which he, of course, put together, and I believe he was the first person who ever made a pair of glasses out of lenses, 2 separate lenses. So they were all in my imagination about Franklin. I think, in a way, when I looked at Franklin in that lovely rose-colored marble room, there was a sound of music. It's a little corny, but I had that sense. And I hearkened back to the fact that music was an important part of my father's life. He couldn't carry a tune. He played Holst's The Planets ad nauseum, and I still don't like Holst's The Planets. But there were sources of music around the house all the time. He also thought he could play the recorder, and that, other than down by the station early in the morning, I didn't know that that was a success. My father was a pack rat, and he implemented his interest in music by bringing home things like an ancient zither. I think it was an antique zither. I don't think he could play it. It was mostly broken. But I remember him demonstrating to my friends the whole physics of sound and music, and the fact that the more taut the strings of the zither were, the higher the notes, so forth. So he brought to the idea of music the idea of tension, and it was an interesting way of demonstrating things. It got worse later on in my youth when he brought home a fairly large pipe organ for a fairly small house. And it sat at the bottom of the steps to the second floor, and we had to sort of squeeze our way around the organ. It didn't play. It had something like a severe case of asthma. The keys only bordered on being musical, but it was a pump organ, and so we got great kicks out of pumping the pedals, and the organ would wheeze. And so he used that when people came to play with the organ, again to demonstrate that the force of the air going through the pipes changed the tones that the pipes emitted, and he never lost a chance to lecture. And fortunately, to some extent, I had some reasonably tolerant friends who put up with this. Another example, I think, of the pervasiveness of science and astronomy was that we had a ton of animals. We had dogs who were named Saki, Psyche, and Tyche. Saki was a I'm losing it again. Socrates was a philosopher rather than an astronomer, but he did bring astronomy into some of what he wrote. So Saki was the first dog. Psyche, as I understand it, is a main belt, fairly large asteroid. So Psyche had nothing to do with the psychiatry I tumbled over a few minutes ago. But Psyche was the second dog in that series. And then Tyche was named after a 16th century Danish astronomer named Tycho Brahe, who developed a number of astronomical instruments, which descendants of which are still being used today. My father, the artist, then at one point while we lived in the Thomas Massey house, decided to copy a painting, an ancient painting of Tycho Brahe, and my mother described it as something like 18 by 30 inches across one of the walls of the living room of the old house. And when later it was restored, I think they scraped away generations of whitewash and found shreds of this kind of archaeological painting in the wall. And people ascribed it to being some kind of medieval art. Well, how medieval art got to 16th and 17th and 18th century Pennsylvania was sort of left to the imagination. Somebody else also thought perhaps this was some kind of Asian art. These were all fantasies on some people's parts. Anyway, Tycho Brahe ended up on our living room walls. Here's something that had nothing to do with astronomy, but I put this in here because it really illustrated what happens when somebody who has kind of creative yens wants something, can't afford to have it, wants it enough to make it himself. And he thought we needed a swimming pool. So he single-handedly dug out 3 feet worth of land. We then lived in Lansdowne. We'd moved from the old house. Dug a lot of dirt out. He threw it up beside the thing. Then he got someone to come and pour concrete. And we had an attractive nuisance, which the kids in the neighborhood loved, and my mother didn't, because she felt very, very responsible. We had a swimming pool in a land where people didn't have swimming pools. And but for the fact that he had the idea and the resources in his brains, and at that point his reasonably strong arms, he just went out and got it. There's another factor. The gentleman on the left or right, whatever direction that is someone named Charles Federer, who was the editor of a number of very prominent magazines about meteorology and astronomy. And he also became one of my father's greatest supporters as the planetarium business started and began to grow. So he was an important part of our life around the swimming pool as well as out in the world. Finally, I got to be a teenager, and so it was my job to rebel. And I sort of did. And I was tired of the stars that I was hearing about, and I got very interested in some other stars, by which I mean celebrities. And I'm using Armand and my father because I flip back and forth about the way I felt him. He had contacts out in the world which went far beyond astronomy and planetariums. He had played Hamlet as a senior in high school and was interested in drama, so he introduced me to the theater and to drama, and it became a really important part of my life, but it also gave me a chance to meet some very fascinating people. One of whom was someone named Brian Ahern, who was an old, I think, mostly grade B movie actor, movie star, and I met him, and that was a huge thrill, even though he was a scruffy old man when I met him. But He was married to Joan Crawford, so that made him kind of interesting. I think very few people here are old enough to remember a comedian named Ernie Kovacs. Oh, good. Well, Ernie Kovacs was much better when he was young than when he got older, to my mind. My father was asked to give the first live television presentations that happened in Philadelphia after the Second World War. And this was at a point when television happened first on Wednesday nights and Friday nights, but on Wednesday there was a news broadcast, film short subjects, and his program, which I think at that point was called something like Shoes and Chips with Armand Spitz. Taken, I don't know who gave him that title. Anyway, it was kind of fun. I got to go to the studio with him. But what was more fun was that there was this young person with a great big cigar hanging out of his mouth, who was Ernie Kovacs, who was terribly funny, who was very kind, and he let me and some friends of mine make props for him. So we would arrive for Armand's show and give Ernie Kovacs pith helmets and masks of gorillas and things like that, and he used them. So I had a real thing about Ernie Kovacs, and that's the kind of thing that really does delight teenagers. Here is another celebrity who was not light in the world. This is a woman named Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. She was the sister of Nehru, who succeeded Gandhi. She was very, very interested and very, very involved in the political maneuverings that got India to be a separate state. She went on to be the president of the United Nations General Assembly for a while, and she came to the Fels Planetarium, probably because my father was involved with the World Affairs Council. And he gave a special lecture for her, and I was there. And he started to talk generally about the stars and the planetarium. And then something really amazing happened. And that was that Madame Panzet interrupted my father. And this had never happened before, I'm quite sure. And she spoke, and I can't remember the words, I wish I did. She had been in prison 3 times because of her political activity. And she spoke about being allowed very occasionally to go out at night to the courtyard of the prison and to look up at the stars and to develop her feelings about humanity and the fact that we could be separate, we could be together, we were all alike under the universe. Again, I can't remember the words, but this was tremendously meaningful to me. So she became a true star in my mind, and she's still there. I wouldn't have had that experience if my father hadn't let himself be interrupted, mainly, for starters. There was another star in my life. Armand was deeply involved, obviously, with museums. He was starting to sell planetariums. We traveled quite a lot, but we never took vacations. We went to museums, we went to planetarium conferences. The only one that I remember distinctly that was wonderful, we're jumping the gun a little bit, that's okay, we'll get to this. I have to talk to about another star, and that was a man named Sam Hinton, who was a marine biologist and a museum person. And this conference was in the Garden of the Gods in Colorado, which is an absolutely spectacular place under the shadow of Pikes Peak. And Sam Hinton sang folk songs. He was kind of a contemporary of Burl Ives. He was absolutely wonderful. My favorite song of his was called "It's a Long Way from Amphioxus." Amphioxus is like a 2 or 3 celled marine creature, and this was the story of evolution told in a folk music genre. It was neat. He's on YouTube all over the place, and he's wonderful. I think another very memorable part of my teen years was that I used to walk from school to my father's office, which was right outside of the planetarium dome at Fells. And I would be there. Once or twice a year, they did a show about space exploration and space travel. I would be doing my homework, and at one point or another in the afternoon, the door would open, and an astronaut, 20 years before there were astronauts, would walk through the office and open another door, which took him to the back of the dome, where there was a backlit platform, and he demonstrated what space flight was going to be like, and remarkably similar ideas of what the vehicles were going to be for space flight. This was most important to me after I got used to the appearance of the astronaut, because it really wowed my friends who had come to do algebra homework with me. That was a kind of experience that every child should have, I think. My father was deeply interested in hoping that young people would take interests in science and pursue them. And he started one of the very early science fairs, which, as you will see, were almost completely open to men and not women, young men and young women. He took the winners of the science fair up to Princeton to meet Albert Einstein. I never even saw this picture until a couple of years ago. A cousin of mine found it. There was also a legend, and I have no idea whether this is true, that he had consulted with Einstein about how to drill the pentangle plates that made up the dodecahedron, that made up the near sphere of the first model of the Spitz planetarium. Whether or not Einstein helped with the equations that got things spaced the way they should have been, I don't know, but it's a kind of neat story, I think. Anyway, there's Albert. He's been sitting on our piano for a number of years, and it's a point of pride and some serious questions, I think, about his part in Armand's life. But I don't mind having that picture on my piano. Years went by, and I finally got to college, and again ventured away from astronomy. The first class that I went to at the University of Pennsylvania was taught by a man named Loren Eiseley, who was an anthropologist. He was a wonderful lecturer. He was an impeccable scientist. I think what affected me most about him was that he spoke very personally about things. And one of the things he talked about was the fact that despite he'd been worldwide, certainly out in the open a lot, he was terrified and always had been terrified of the night and of dark. And he had real panic attacks and terrors. He mentioned this frequently. At just about the time that my father was going to unveil the second model of his planetarium, just a few blocks away from Penn. So I got unaccustomedly gutsy, and I asked Dr. Eiseley if he would like to come, thinking he never would. And he showed up with his wife. And he sat there, and I guess he absorbed things. I was waiting for him to have a meltdown, but he didn't. I went back to my class the next week, and at the end of that first class, he said, "Miss Spitz, I would like to talk with you." And I thought, oh God. Wait, what happened to this man after he left? And I don't know what happened, but what he did was thank me and say that there was a profound feeling he felt of warmth and an association with the stars and an acceptance of the dark that he had not felt previously. And I don't know whether that was just a gracious thing to say, but it was really, really meaningful to me. And I like to think that my father's passion for the stars also was combined with the use of seeing the stars as a good thing for people to have inside them. Anyway, Loren Eiseley incidentally went on to write a number of wonderful books, two of which, one was called The Night Country. This is an anthology, I think his last book. Eiseley was very, very poetic and wrote some poetry too. There's a decidedly astronomical looking cover to this. W.H. Auden wrote the preface to it, and I doubt that he got the idea for this from going to the planetarium, but it still really mattered to me that was what he did. There were a couple of other things that were kind of funny but meaningful to me. My father used to make Easter eggs, and he made collars from them from 3x5 cards and decorated them with decorated them with colored pencils. The collars were all very interesting, solid geometry kind of shapes. And I got this thing that I really liked doing some art projects. So he made Christmas cards, and I have to make Christmas cards because I don't believe in Christmas cards unless I make them, which is ridiculous. And a little piece of baggage that I got from him. But it was kind of fun. He also, at one point or another, did some paintings of, this is a galaxy. Somebody told me a week or so. My daughter's, what? Okay. Andromeda? Oh, thank you. I ought to have known that. Anyway, I have this, one of his early colleagues sent this to me. What I didn't get to bring along was some of the ties that he decorated too. I mean, painting ties was really an in thing, I think, at that point. A number of people wrote about Armand. There was someone in 1994 who wrote a master's thesis about him, which horrified me when I first saw it because there were so many errors in it. Then later, and I think Joyce pointed this book out to me. This is a book called Theaters of Time and Space by a man named Jordan Marche. It's an amazing history of planetariums in this country. He devoted a whole chapter to my father, but what really blew me away was the fact that he is there throughout the book, and he apparently was far more instrumental in the development not only of planetariums, but just in interest in science and astronomy and education, far more than I ever knew. However, I found, as I had found in this first thesis, some errors, one of which, and I will quote, if I can find it, there was the quote that said, according to Spitz's second wife, Grace Scholl Spitz, get this, one of Armand's favorite recreations was to repaint Quaker meeting houses. And I thought, what? The vision of my father in overalls with paint spatters and buckets and carrying a ladder and a few dirty brushes, that just didn't seem right. This is the meeting house that he painted. He never repainted meeting houses. This hangs in our dining room, as a matter of fact. But there were some remarkably funny things from personal and non-scientific standpoints that went through both of these pieces of information. I found I questioned some of the facts in the books, but the only ones that he got my birth date wrong, for heaven's sake. So anyway, but both of these things were real tributes to what Armand did. I felt too that his work and his passions spread out to other people and other forms of art and expression. I've talked about my mother's book, which was called Earthshine, which was never published. But it talked about him, it talked about the Thomas Massey House and our life there. It influenced my mother's expression as seen by writing that book. Are we at the point where we can see the... Okay, here's another. I have a cousin whose name is Elsa. I think she is a gifted illustrator. And she thought my father was a wizard and a magician, and I think for some people he was. But she translated stories that he told and ideas that he had into a fantasy of stars and planets and space exploration. She also liked cats. And so if you look carefully at the large figure, this is a cat, but this is also her concept of what a galaxy was. So I just loved the fact that other people took something from him and translated it into other forms, and that matters a lot to me. I need to talk a little bit about the legacies that I think he left. His passion spread widely. The facts that he presented through the planetarium and through various lectures spread to a large number of people. I think one of his greatest legacies is you, because you're interested in the work that he did, in the implements that spread it. Just the fact that Spitz Incorporated makes planetariums, makes domes, houses domes in splendid buildings, and brings people to see stars and planets and graphics which explain astronomical facts. And I'm learning more and more about how widespread Spitz's activities have grown because of this institution. You who are using Spitz products and seeing the planetarium are spreading his zeal and his excitement. And I think he'd be really grateful to know that. And I have to thank you for that. Legacies to me, this is a kick in a way. His creativity and activity and joy in making things, I think, is something that really matters a lot to me. Making small bits of information, have some waves out to other people, means a lot to me. Need to make Christmas cards. Makes me feel somewhat fulfilled, and I enjoy it. There are some other legacies, however, which I have to talk about. My kids and I have inherited many of his genes. We are incredibly bad pack rats, and we are housekeeping challenged to the nth degree. Don't laugh. It's really a pain sometimes. I have to backtrack for 1 minute, and I'm wandering, and I'm sorry. I talked about my mother's earthshine. She wrote some poetry. She wrote a poem which is filled with images and references to astronomical things because she lived with this man she loved for a long time. And she wrote a poem called Falling Star, which I am not going to read because if I do, I will cry. But if anyone is interested in reading it, it is up here, and I invite you to do so. I forgot another thing. I didn't follow my outline very well, but I'm going to ask your help with this. This is a proof sheet of some photographs which were taken about a week after Sputnik went up. And Armand apparently at one point had said, well, I know somebody's going to go up in the air sooner or later. I hope it's this country. And it wasn't. But as a result of some of his work he'd done with amateur astronomers all over the country, he was named the coordinator of visual observation for the satellite program in its very, very early days. This is a picture. I saw it. We thought, my husband and I thought, by God, he's in a space capsule with the skylights and the equipment that would be there. There was somebody there who looked very much like an astronaut. The only problem was this was taken 10 years before man got anywhere near the moon. I need help from anybody who knows anything about the space movement to help me identify who and where this was. I know it's my father. I don't know who the other person was, and the timing is all mistaken. If you have any insights, please let me know. I need to go back to legacies. And I thought I had one up there, but I didn't. I am going to read a couple of sentences from something that was written and published in the Franklin Institute News in December of 1943. He had started the Institute News and was its editor until he was kicked upstairs and became the director of education at the Institute. This starts: "The most untidy spot in the Franklin Institute is the desk of Armand Spitz. Brunt of constant criticism and object of flippant comment, it reflects its owner's 30-track mind. On it right now might be found cloud lantern slides, reservation forms for school visits, a book on plastics, and one on adult education." It goes on and on. This is the most authoritative piece of journalism that has ever been written about Armand Spitz. Every fact in it is undeniably authentic and right on. I wish I had discovered it before. My cousin Susie sent this to me a few years ago, and I had never seen it. Goes on to describe a lot of what he had done, a lot of what his passions were, about his interests, about how he wanted to spread the word. It's funny. And it was Armand, and and I hesitate to end this way, but I will. His initials were AS for Armand Spitz. This is signed BS. And guess who wrote it? And that's about all I can tell you about Armand Spitz and what it was like to grow up with him. Thank you. Thank you.